Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talent Smart EQ's LinkedIn Live series, Emotional Intelligence for Your Everyday Life. While we're waiting for some people to join us, we'd love to know where you're coming from, so feel free to say hello in the chat. Hello, Taryn and Howard.
Hello.
Where they're coming from, you mean like location,
Where they
not
are
where they're
based.
coming
Yeah.
from today. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And where are you, Maggie?
I am based in San Diego. What about you, Howard?
I'm based in Del Mar, California.
Nice. Taryn, what about you?
I am in Charleston, South Carolina. So if my internet goes out, we're looking pretty good out there right now. But I know lots of people are in the path of Hurricane Ian. So if you are, please stay safe out there. And if my internet goes out, you'll know why.
Perfect. Thanks for saying that. Well, and looks like we've got some people from Chicago, from North Carolina, from Virginia. So wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have this conversation to talk about how we create a more emotionally intelligent work culture. So for those of you who don't know, Talent Smart EQ is the world's premier provider of emotional intelligence assessments, programs, solutions around the world. As Howard and I explained, we are based in San Diego, California. That's where he and I are both joining from. I am Maggie Sass, and with me today is the Executive Vice President of Client Solutions, Taryn McKenzie. In this role, Taryn leads our team working with corporations, military, police departments, and organizations across the globe to deliver EQ training. Taryn has a passion for executive education and training, and she's been leading teams for over 20 years in this space. Welcome, Taryn.
Thank you, Maggie. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And then, of course, joining Taryn and me is the CEO of Talent Smart EQ, Howard Farfel. Howard has led Talent Smart for the past 3 years and was most recently the president of Ken Blanchard Companies. He's also been the executive at several organizations in various industries, ranging from consumer products to tech to sports, and has been part of some very different corporate cultures along the way. So thanks for being here, Howard.
Thank you. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, of course. So let's get started. And I'm going to start with you, Howard. How would you define organizational culture, and what is it that differentiates an emotionally intelligent culture? What does that look and feel like?
Yeah. Well, I guess first, when I think about workplace culture, I think it's really about how work is getting done in the organization. How are people connecting? How do employees, talk about the organization when they're talking with friends or family or over the dining room table? Those are the things I think that are really what culture is. And, leaders and executives really have the responsibility of defining the vision, the values, the strategies, and kind of mandating those things. And that certainly contributes to shaping the culture. But culture is not something that can be mandated, and so those are both parts of culture. But in the end, it's really the employees, it's the people that decide what that culture is going to be. And so, I think, nobody starts by thinking we want to have a toxic culture, but I think a lot of times you hear that organizations have a toxic culture. And so it's about really leadership deciding and being intentional about what they want that culture to be, and then role modeling those behaviors and seeing if they can influence it and shape it so that employees see what is tolerated, what is expected, and what kind of gets acknowledged and rewarded. So to me, those are all important things about what company culture is and can be. And I know there's the famous Drucker quote, as much as you want to focus on strategy and getting things done, it's, in the end, culture will eat strategy for breakfast, is what he says. And which that really means is, they can both coexist and they're both really important. But if you think you can drive culture and drive your strategy no matter what, in the end, culture will decide what actually gets done. So those are some thoughts on culture in general and why it's just so important to think about both that as well as the vision, the strategy, and what you're trying to do. Yeah. And then when I think about an emotionally intelligent, culture, I think it's one that is, first of all, kind of fearless, right? It's like you don't want to be operating in a culture, an organization where there's a lot of fear going around. You want people feeling comfortable speaking out, sharing ideas, taking risks and knowing what those risk parameters should be. I think you want an emotionally intelligent culture would be one that is collaborative, empathetic, and that you've got people who are connected to the mission and to each other. And so when you got things like that all firing on all cylinders, I think you have an emotionally intelligent culture, and you have one that's going to really have a lot of benefits from operating that way.
Yeah, I love that. And you're so right. I think you can't just say this is what our culture is going to be and then have it be so. Unfortunately, that's not how it really works. But I think you can, like you said, put together a set of values and then work to really live them as a company. I know clients who've had rallying cry meetings and focus groups and meetings by function or by department to really talk about what do those values really mean for us? What does that look like if we're living those values? And it might look differently across departments, across functions, but they need to be part of the air that employees breathe, right? They can't just be something that's on a wall or on, in an HR manual in some desk somewhere. They have to be things that are really sort of part of the DNA of the culture to truly be lived. For those of you listening, I'm really interested what you think about this. What does an emotionally intelligent culture look or feel like to you? What are people doing or saying? What are the behaviors that really stand out for you? So you can go ahead and feel free to drop those into the chat. But so I'm curious why we should care if our company and the people who work there are emotionally intelligent, and why that's important. So Taryn, how might you respond to that?
Well, I think from the leadership perspective, it's really about developing people who feel empowered and engaged and motivated. And it literally can be the difference between people just kind of showing up every day and punching the clock and doing what they think is, part of the job description, versus people who really strive to exceed the expectations in just about everything they do. I think sometimes leaders can focus so much on the metrics and the numbers that they fail to recognize the correlation. And it's something that directly impacts productivity. Like if people feel engaged and they feel motivated, they're going to show up to work better and more productive. And then from the employee perspective, the reason why you should care is because, you're the one showing up empowered and engaged and motivated. So when the whole organization embraces this mentality that kind of everyone's in this together, we're all rowing in the same direction, that's when you're really in an emotionally intelligent culture. And that feels pretty good just about to everyone involved.
Yeah, I love that. And we've got some agreement here in the chats and some interesting ideas about inclusivity and a place where people can be authentic, and this idea of trust. And Howard, you talked about this, where people can speak up, where their voice is heard, and not just heard but asked for, right? That people are being asked what their opinion is and what's working and what's not working. Jeremy has a great question in the chat about sort of what this looks like in a hybrid environment. And Jeremy, we're going to get to your question in a second here, but I think this has been something that organizations and especially leaders have been wrestling with over the last couple of years, because the pandemic and what that did to our organizations sort of flipped culture on its head. So much of culture gets built in these everyday moments, and in a lot of ways that's easier to do if you're co-located. And so you have to be more intentional when you're remote. You have to be more intentional when you don't have teams that are all in the same space together. So we'll be talking about that in a second. So okay, so we know what it looks and sort of sounds and feels like and why it's important. I want to talk about some ways to start thinking about how we do this, how we actually build an emotionally intelligent organization. So Howard, where might a company start?
Well, I think, really starts with the leadership team and the executives, and it starts with intentionality. So, you've got to decide and determine that this is the culture you aspire to, and you need to all be aligned that there are real benefits and measurable benefits to having an emotionally intelligent culture. And, as that's defined and decided, then again, it can't be mandated and just say, hey, here's what our culture is and start living it. It's got to be, role modeled. And so people are going to pay attention to what is being said, and then more importantly, what actions are being taken and whether that's aligned. So I think that determining that, committing to it as a leadership team, being aligned that way. And, I think I have also found that, when you have an inspiring vision and mission that people understand and feel a part of, and can articulate it, then that really helps kind of bring things together from the front line to the executive ranks. And so there's a lot more opportunity to shape that culture more quickly. And and then you just have to be really pay attention to those behaviors that you maybe are tolerating as leaders, and therefore enabling. And everybody will notice that and pick up on that. And when they see certain behaviors are not tolerated, then those behaviors will slowly go away. So I think it just starts with intentionality. I think being really clear on the values, not just the vision and the mission. And when you define the values, I think it's incredibly important that you come up with the behaviors of how you operationalize that value. Because otherwise, as you mentioned, values can just be words up on a wall, and they don't really mean very much. But if you're really clear on what it means what those behaviors look like when you're embodying or role modeling those behaviors, all of that can contribute and get you moving, towards a culture that you're looking for. And then the final thing is investing in your people, right? Yeah. Particularly emotional intelligence, which is a skill that can be developed, as we have all come to understand, and not everybody knows that. And if you really want to build emotional intelligence into the ecosystem of your organization, then people need to understand it. People need to be trained on it, and they need opportunity to practice in a safe environment. So if you kind of help to build and develop those skills, then those will start to be put into practice.
Yeah, I love that. And it sounds like we sort of have a theme here around the idea of intentionality. And I think it's a big one, but it's an important one to stress. And we had a comment in the chat from Craig about sort of being intentional about what you're talking about in one-on-ones, this idea of asking what's working, what's not working, or mining for conflict. And I think in a lot of organizations, we are focused on specific metrics of success, and those are important: revenue, growth, right, things like that. And we talk a lot about those things, and I think it's a both and, it's not either or. I think sometimes we make false binaries. We're either successful or we're nice as a culture, right? And I think you have to be both to be successful in the short term and the long term. And it's how do we sort of slow down to speed up? How do we create space for what people need? And the way that you do that is by being intentional and creating behaviors around good communication and conflict, managing conflict, things like that. There's a Yogi Berra quote: if you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere else or wind up somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that applies to organizational culture too, because if you aren't architecting and building towards something, you can end up with a culture that you really don't want, or one that really doesn't support sort of what you're doing. And it's interesting, I've worked with clients in the past that have sort of accidentally found that they have a healthy, strong, emotionally intelligent culture. And a lot of that is because they've hired people with high EQ. And that's great, right? I think that says something about a culture that attracts people who have that skill, people who value that skill, who put energy into working on that skill. But the truth is that EQ isn't static. So it isn't a check the box. It's not something that you achieve and then it's done. It's a skill just like any other, like Howard mentioned. And if it isn't nurtured, or your organization doesn't create the spaces for that behavior to thrive, or if that behavior isn't rewarded as much as other behaviors, then people might leave. And then overnight, you might have a problem with your organizational culture. So I think it's about intentionality, and it's also about checking over time. It's not something that you achieve and then it's over.
Yeah.
Taryn, what do you think about this? Where do you think an organization can start?
Well, Howard mentioned that, it starts at the top, and it 100% does. But he also mentioned kind of the folks on the front line, and really it's everybody in between. One of the things that I love about emotional intelligence is that everybody has a role. You as an individual can improve your own EQ, and that can have kind of a cascading impact on everyone around you. In fact, it's funny, when we talk to organizations about executive training, they'll say, well, we're doing diversity, equity, inclusion training, or we've got new hire onboarding training, or we've got leadership training. And really, we encourage everyone to start with kind of a baseline of EQ. That foundational component is going to be so important before you start building everything on top of that. You know, you think about, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion training, like some folks mentioned in the chat, which is so important. But if you don't really understand kind of self-awareness and empathy, you know, it's really hard to get deeper than that. So I think that's what we really say is, you know, where should organizations start? If you can have a foundational baseline of kind of EQ training for your organization, then you can build on top of that whatever else, what other training initiatives you want.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. So let's double click on this a little bit. How like what is the reality of what an organization or its leaders are doing? What does an organization do to spend time nurturing and influencing an emotionally intelligent work culture? What would you say about that, Howard?
You know, one thing that comes to mind for me is an example, I guess, at a couple of organizations I've been at, is really building kind of high involvement. And so one example that we did even recently at TalentSmart was a high involvement approach to our values, right? And so again, there are certain things that, you know, at leadership level in terms of casting out a vision, really an executive team has to really spend the time and articulate that for the rest of the organization and get feedback. But that's really from the top. Values, I felt like, could really be a collaborative effort and a high involvement strategy. And so to actually work together, even in this COVID environment, and like somebody mentioned, in a remote environment, we still found a way to work together and really come up with how we wanted to operate as an organization, what words kind of resonated with everybody and felt like the right balance of values. And we spent, you know, probably a couple of months working together on what we all believed the right value set was for TalentSmart, and then equally importantly, taking that time to identify what the congruent and incongruent behaviors were for each value. Because instead of just using a word like integrity, it's like, okay, what does that really look like day to day?
What are you doing?
You know, think about those words, but really think about those behaviors so that you can objectively kind of call people out on a values check when, you know, things don't seem to be consistent with what we all kind of had in mind. And so to me, I think, you know, using a high involvement approach, being really clear on vision and values and mission, and having that really connect with, and everybody kind of understanding their role in how they can not only help deliver on the mission, but all the strategies and the goals that people are looking at day to day. And so much of it is just staying consistent, role modeling, and repeating. And you might feel like, oh, I've said this every day, or I'm saying this all the time. And then you check and people don't feel like they've really heard it or absorbed it. So I think there's a lot to over communication and consistency.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Well, and this goes back to the question we had from Jeremy about remote work. So we worked with a client back in January who, like a lot of companies, was trying to be really intentional about building a hybrid workforce culture. And, you know, went through a lot of the same things that TalentSmart was going through as far as, you know, what are our real values? What does that really look like in real life? And, you know, they had sent thousands of employees to work from home back in 2020, and now sort of wanted to think through and leverage the benefits of remote work, but then also capture the synergies of working together in co-located spaces. And that's very hard to do. It's very hard to figure out what that's going to look like and for it to be equitable for everybody. But I thought it was a really great example about being intentional about culture, because they brought in consultants on the technology side and on the business side, which I think a lot of companies were doing to really get remote right, to get hybrid right. But then they brought us in to think about the human side of the hybrid equation, which I thought was this perfect balance, because part of what we were talking with them about was about them, started with them. Like, how do you feel about what's happening right now in this pandemic? How do you talk about remote work? All of that sort of trickles down, whether you wanted to or not, to your teams. And if you're not sort of managing your emotions around the pandemic and its impact on how you're working and leading, then you might be getting outcomes that you don't want. But we also talked about sort of the real units of culture. So what does it look like to trust somebody that you've never met face to face. A lot of the employees in this company had been interviewed, hired, and had worked for a year and had never met anybody face to face. And so, what does that look like? And then what are metrics that you're using to talk about productivity and outcomes, right? There's so many pieces of this that are about what it means to be a human inside an organization. And if organizations are not paying attention to all of the human pieces of it, then they can get lost, they can get missed, and then you're not being intentional. And so you create a culture because you're not managing it, you're not actively managing it. So I love what you said too, Taryn, because I think you're right. We hear from clients a lot, like EQ is just another thing. It's another thing in the list of like thousands of things that we have to do. And what I would say is emotional intelligence is not an extra thing. It's the lifeblood. It's sort of the essential component of all the things that you're trying to do. It's figuring out how to teach people to think of it as a vehicle through which they can be successful in these other things. So, Taryn, organizations tend to focus a lot on individual emotional intelligence or EQ, but there's also this concept of organizational or team EQ. What is that all about, and how do you use both to influence a culture of emotional intelligence?
Yeah, so the concept of like organizational EQ or team EQ can be really difficult to grasp. A lot of times clients will say to us, well, if we focus on each individual EQ, won't that impact the collective whole? And the answer is yes. And,
Ish.
Ish. Here's how I like to think about it. Imagine you're a coach at the NFL draft and you have somehow landed the #1 draft pick for every single position there is. So let's just say all 53 players on your football team are literally the #1 pick at that respective position. So should we just kind of wrap up the whole season and assume that you will automatically win the Super Bowl, that team, they've got the best player at every position, should they automatically win the Super Bowl? And we all say, well, of course not. Intuitively, we know that kind of a championship worthy team is so much more than just stacking the deck and making sure you've got the best player at every role or every position. So, you can call it what you want, but it's that collective energy, that synergy, that unique magic when everyone is hitting on all cylinders. And the same exact thing happens with work teams. So you think about a work team, how does your team handle stress? How do you handle change? How do you handle conflicts and challenges when they come up? And so at the end of the day, you can actually have a whole team of like absolute EQ rock stars where every single person could individually be really high EQ and your team could still not be optimized. You still might not be hitting on all cylinders. And so that's where team EQ comes in. And again, it takes a while to kind of think through that. We actually just wrote a book on it. And, I'm always having to explain to clients, the difference between it. Yeah. But it's that collective EQ of the entire group that really ensures that the sum is greater than each part.
Yeah, I love that too, because I think especially now in 2022, we've got more organizations that are matrixed, that are sort of complicated in the way in which work actually gets done between and inside teams. And so you've got more interdependence than ever before. And so this idea of how do we really create 1 + 1 = 17, right? How do you really get the biggest bang for your energy as a team? And I think it's also, we're humans. Like the pandemic, if nothing else, taught us all that we all have breaking points, right? If you're sitting trying to do your work and your 5-year-old is melting down on Zoom and like the trash truck is coming by and your cat walks across the screen, like
you say that like you've been there.
just a small example, but I think we all have breaking points, and we all have the potential for having low EQ moments, right? Because you get overwhelmed by change, by things that are happening in your external environment. And one of the benefits of this focus on team EQ is that you are a team that can support each other when you're down. It's the same idea when you think about building teams based on strengths, right? Different people have different strengths, and you're leveraging those in one another, and you are not required to make up the difference in certain areas where maybe you don't have the same strengths, and so it really allows you to go further than maybe what you have as a collective. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so this all sounds great. It sounds like we've really got organizational culture mapped here, and it makes a lot of sense why we would focus on this and sort of the benefits of it. But let's talk about the reality of when this doesn't go well, what gets in the way.
Yeah.
For our listeners who are with us, I'd love to know your perspective on this. So feel free to drop this in chat. What gets in the way of building beautiful, emotionally intelligent cultures? What have you seen? What have you been a part of? But let's start with you, Howard. What have you seen in your career that gets in the way of emotionally intelligent cultures?
Impatience is probably number one, and again, back to a lack of understanding that a culture is not born overnight and mandated and all of a sudden becomes real. So it's having that patience to stick to the vision of that culture, what you're aspiring to, how you're communicating it, and looking for change agents, I think, in the organization at all levels, right? That are bought in, that get it, that are role modeling it. And how can you tap into those early adopters, those change agents who might do a much better influencing than you might in our role as a leader? So I think that having that patience, looking for those opportunities to continue to shape and reinforce, I think is one. I think another is just the natural urgency that we're all in when we are navigating so many changes in the world right now, and how quickly and the business is changing, workplaces are changing, and not just because of COVID. It's been going on, right, with technology. So workplaces have been moving and changing, and while you're navigating and reacting to that, it's very easy and typical to take your eye off the culture ball or other organizational challenges. And so it's trying to find that balance, right? Not everything can be just about long-term and about, shaping a culture. You got to be executing, you got to, be delivering, you got to be generating cash. So that's the fuel that keeps the organization alive, as does culture. So it's, I think, finding that balance. And as a emerging leader or high potential leader, starting to figure out how do you spend as much time working on the business as in the business, right? In the business is the day-to-day weeds, and we've all got to do it. But can you take a step back and think about how you work on the business and shaping it? And if you can find that right balance, that can do wonders. Otherwise, that becomes another big obstacle. And then I think Taryn said it already. There's shiny objects. There's learning and development. Priorities du jour, or, you're an HR leader or learning development person might change over, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, let's not invest in this. Let's move over here. And you can give people kind of ADD with all the different learning and development things that, of course, are all great. But how do you stick with some things and make sure that they get adopted and practiced? And as Taryn said, EQ is so foundational. It can help in so many other ways. So if you're struggling with managing conflict, you're struggling with communication skills, resiliency, if there is an underlying foundation of stronger emotional intelligence, then all those other development initiatives will actually go much more quickly and more efficiently.
Yeah, love that. Taryn, what would you add?
Yeah, it's so hard. I was reading some of the comments in the chat, and someone's asking about motivating individual employees that are not embracing the culture and not kind of getting on board, and I think that's real. That's a struggle, and I think the best way to approach that is just kind of to be authentic and say, what does drive you? What does motivate you? And I'm talking about from the leadership perspective, to have those conversations with those employees. And really figuring out, what drives them, what gets them out of bed in the morning, what are they excited about, what's not working. And I think sometimes just kind of having those candid, authentic, one-on-ones with people, they'll reveal to you what's going on. It might be something that's completely not related to work and they're, going through some personal challenges. Or it might be something that they're going through at work that, they're overwhelmed or they're overloaded or overstressed. And I think, Howard, you made a great point earlier about, kind of setting those expectations about what you as an organization or what you as a leader will tolerate and not tolerate. We talked about earlier, like, rowing the boat and everyone's rowing in the same direction. If it feels like someone's taken the oar and literally like, slamming it into the water and kind of, prohibiting that movement toward whatever that common objective or goal is, I think it's about sitting them down and saying, hey, like, I've noticed, you're not really getting on board with this project or not getting on board with this initiative, or it just feels like you're checking the box and doing kind of the bare minimum. What's going on? How can I motivate you? How can I incent you? Is it that you don't understand the expectations of the role? Is it that you don't see kind of the greater cause that could be kind of, enveloping the whole project? So I really think it's having those conversations and being authentic and saying, what's going on right now? Because I'm sensing something's off.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, and what I was going to say too is the other big thing related to culture that I think has always been important, but has been of a big focus the last couple of years, is intentionally thinking about and building cultures that work for everyone.
Yeah.
So if your culture only rewards some people, then it isn't necessarily a healthy culture. And so part of that is a lack of understanding of how diversity, equity, and inclusion intersects this idea of organizational culture. And I think the question about motivating is a really good one, because I think it's not simple, right? I think that's such a varied, layered conversation about individuals. There's a big conversation right now around quiet quitting and sort of what does that look like? And is everybody expected to be someone who shows up and gives 120%? And I think it depends, right? I think there's a big conversation sort of around what is it that individuals bring to a culture to help build a culture. And then this conversation we've been having about tone at the top and sort of what is being architected by the leaders and managers of a company, and how does that also get grown from the bottom up, right? I think it's a both and. Okay, so Taryn, you lead client solutions who work with our clients around the globe. We just talked about sort of what gets in the way. What are some success stories that you've seen when organizations bring emotional intelligence in, related to really focusing on building healthy cultures?
Yeah, I think one thing that's incredible about organizational EQ is that it really transcends across almost every industry. So, right now we're literally working with clients such as police departments that have incorporated EQ into their training and seen incidents with force go down. They've seen their community relations improve. We work with military branches who are utilizing EQ to help combat mental health challenges like anxiety and depression and PTSD. And then, of course, our main, client base is corporate clients around the globe, and they see improvements in, resiliency and collaboration and communication. So I think it's really varied across the board in terms of the success that we see our clients have. But by far, I think the greatest thing that we hear clients say is that EQ training has impacted every facet of their lives. I mean, people will write us or, call us and say that their relationship, not just with their boss and their colleagues, but their relationship with their spouse or their adult children, has been impacted.
Or their baby children.
Or their baby children. Maggie has a 2-year-old and we're constantly talking about baby children. But it's one of the few skills that really can positively impact almost every interaction and every relationship you have. And so I think that's the most, the most impactful aspect of our work.
Yeah, I love that. Those are great examples. Okay, Howard. So you have been the CEO at multiple organizations. What is your biggest takeaway when it comes to what it takes to build or influence a culture to be emotionally intelligent?
Well, first, I think that I got to acknowledge Maggie has taught us that you can actually teach EQ to a 2-year-old toddler. So that is my most recent learning. So thank you, Maggie. It gives us all help that we can all continue to learn and get better. I want to acknowledge, I think, something that, that is part of my learnings, and I think Jeremy has hit on it as well, is just the connection, between an emotionally intelligent culture and EQ in general to actual performance and metrics. And that's another one I should have added to what gets in the way. And there's, definitely a lack of understanding and belief sometimes that some of these touchy-feely type skills are also going to help, the business. And I think it's really important for people to understand that and demonstrate these connections. And if you have to pilot or take small pockets to do so, that is what it takes in some organizations where maybe some of the leaders aren't buying into it or don't believe it's going to improve short-term or even long-term results. It's really important to be able to present that business case, to share a business case, whether it's from similar companies or an area where you can actually, pilot and demonstrate it to yourself. So, I think that's really, one of the things that's been a big takeaway for me. I think it gets back to, some of the same points that we've shared, right? It starts at the top with being intentional. Mm-hmm. It starts by role modeling and showing those behaviors that you're expecting from others. Yep. And making sure you are acknowledging and rewarding those that are really representing the culture well, and not tolerating and enabling the behaviors that are not. And I think the last thing I think that's really come through more clearly for me, and Taryn just said it, is when you're investing in people in a way that is not only improving their technical skills, their work skills, but potentially changing their lives and making them more content, more productive as people, having better relationships at home. It's really meaningful and when you get their people who are feeling good about themselves and their personal lives and their professional lives, that is going to carry over to how productive and results oriented, they are, and the organization is going to thrive because of that. But it's all those things working together that I think, gives us a great opportunity for success in organizations.
Yeah. Thanks. I can't remember who posted this, but I saw on LinkedIn not that long ago a quote that said, "Hard skills get you in, but soft skills get you far." And I think when I think of that relative to organizations, I think of that as the staying power of an organization that is healthy enough to attract and retain good talent and grow, because people really want to be there. They want to be there to help the company grow, not just in the metrics that we always talk about when we think about a company's success, but also, what does it feel like to actually be part of that culture? Anything that you would add? We have to wrap this up, but any final thoughts, Howard or Taryn, about this idea of organizational culture and what it takes to be emotionally intelligent?
Taryn, I kind of gave my final thoughts. Anything more that you'd like to add?
Yeah, no, just that I think, there's just, I actually don't like the term, soft skills, because it sounds like a nice to have, not a need to have. And,
Yeah.
You think about something as crucial as emotional intelligence and, like I said, kind of being that foundational level for pretty much any other training and development that you can build on top of it. I just think it's so crucial to every conversation, every relationship you have, that I think that to skip that step is where a lot of people fail. So
yeah, thanks. Well, thank you to both of you for taking the time to join me this morning. I really appreciate it. Just as a reminder to all of you that are listening, this conversation actually caps up a month-long focus on organizational culture. And so what we'll do is drop into the chat links to additional resources in case you missed them. We had a webinar and also a blog post that went out this month on this topic. And I just want to remind everyone that we'll be back at the end of October for our next Emotional Intelligence for Your Everyday Life conversation. And we'll be exploring how important emotional intelligence can be when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and your efforts in that area. For all of us at Talent Smart, I'm Maggie Sass. And remember, EQ is for your everyday life. See you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Maggie.
Of course.